breaking news. Great loss.
Huge.
Milwaukee Brewers have announced that Bob Uecker, the voice of the Milwaukee Brewers for 54 years, a baseball Hall of Famer and local, statewide, and national icon, Bob Uecker died today at the age of 90 years old. If you would like to share some of your favorite memories about Uecker, he's just been such an intrinsic part of this team for so long.
Yeah.
And if you're of a certain age, you'll remember his appearances on the Johnny Carson show.
Mr. Belvedere.
Mr. Belvedere. What a remarkable life he had. He is greatly going to be missed.
Yeah.
As this broke right before we were coming on the air, you said too, it's a shame he never got to see them in the World Series.
Yeah. That was every time that the Brewers would be in the locker room with the goggles on and pouring champagne, he would be there. And as much as I wanted to see them win as a team and win for us, I think it's safe to say if you are even a casual Brewers fan, you wanted to see the Brewers win for Uke.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. And got close a couple times, but he was probably the biggest fan. He loved
Absolutely
them
so much.
And he,
and just loved the game.
And the players loved him. He always was about baseball. He was always like, he had that coaching sensibility beyond the field with them, talking to them, but just having good conversations and just like a grandpa.
And he was funny as hell.
Yes.
He really was.
Yes.
Mike Clemens, sports reporter for Civic Media, is joining us on the phone. Good morning, Mike. I wish we had happier things to talk about this morning, but certainly in all of your years covering Wisconsin sports, I'm sure you've had more than one interaction with the one and only Bob Uecker.
Yeah, Jane, Greg, the Brewers putting out a press release in the last half hour that Bob passed away early this morning at his home at the age of 90, as you said. I know that he'd been dealing with some heart troubles and had some surgery that he talked about several years ago. And there's tough things that happened in Bob's life, too. He lost a daughter a couple of years ago to a lung disease. I think it was ALS, and he spoke about that. But in the last few years, he had cut back on his schedule. First, not doing games on the road,
right,
and then just doing all the home games. And then, in the last couple of years, he might do one game of a home game series. But the last game he did was that playoff loss that the Brewers had. It was kind of a Cinderella year. Pat Murphy taking over as manager, and but Devin Williams came out there and they had a horrible performance as a closer, and they lost to the Mets, I think 4-2. And Uke was. Of course, the team was down because their season has just come to an end. But he was going around and talking to players and folks in the clubhouse, and some of them were turning away, shaking their heads, maybe having a tear in their eye. And you kind of got the sense, and they kept that within to themselves, that maybe Uecker was saying, I don't know if I'll be back next year, but, you're a great kid, and I hope the best for you. If he was saying goodbye that night.
There's just so much to talk about when you talk about Mr. Baseball and his long career. And I think one of the things that fans loved about him so much, Mike, was his self-deprecating sense of humor, because no one made more fun of his actual career as a baseball player than Bob Uecker, right?
Well, for 60 years, he made fun of his 6-year career in the major league. Right?
Yes.
So he's a kid from Milwaukee who works his way up to the minors. Told these stories during those Brewers broadcasts were just wonderful about sharing a station wagon to drive up to Eau Claire so he could play in the minor leagues for a summer. And then he plays for the Braves and for the Cardinals, a World Series team back in the 60s. And when he gets done with that, Bud Selig calls him back and says, why don't you come to Milwaukee? We're bringing the pilots to town, and I'd like you to be part of the broadcast crew. And he's next to Merle Harmon and some other great broadcasters, and soon became, because of his sense of humor and just his storytelling ability, he became the legendary, absolutely amazing play-by-play announcer. And even up to that last broadcast last fall, he was still one of the best in the business.
By far.
He's in the top names, like when you think like the Vin Scullys and all those guys, like that voice, the knowledge, and the passion for the sport was undeniable when you listen to him call a game.
And I think
and then he became a speaker on the speaking tour. And one night he's at some banquet, and one of the guys who was the stars there was Al Hurt, a trumpet player, It was very popular in the 60s.
Yeah.
Played at the very first Super Bowl. Al said, I'm telling you, you're great. He goes, I've got friends on the Carson show. I'm going to get you on the Tonight Show. And that's how that started with that great run he had. And then that became Mr. Belvedere. And then the incredible job he did in Major League.
Right.
Which was filmed in Milwaukee and doing the play-by-play for that. Just a bit outside.
He used to kill Johnny Carson when he would be on the Tonight Show. Johnny Carson would be dying from Uecker stories.
Oh, yeah. That's, I mean, you know, he came after the first night he did it, and he was so dry, and he looked like he was so offended because the audience would laugh at him when he told the stories. Like he said, you know, when I tried to get into Major League Baseball, they said it would be $3,000, and he said, you know, my dad eventually came up with the money. So, you know, but after he left, Carson leaned over to Ed McMahon and said, did he really play baseball? And said, yeah, he really was a baseball player.
Yeah. I mean, the growing up, hearing him as a kid, and then as you said, Major League. And Mr. Belvedere, like those are all like my 80s memories of him. My grandma used to work. She worked at County Stadium from, I think it's from when it was built until the early 90s. And she always had lovely things to say about him, about the players, but she was there in Major League too. So it's like, there's all these great memories of him. And I love, you know, he's a part of Milwaukee lore, and he's part of the legend as the legend himself. I mean, he'll never be forgotten. And what's great is that he is just like, he'll always have that seat up in the stadium. If you look, like the Uecker seat,
the nosebleed,
where you can always remember him.
Yeah, and Greg, Bob Uecker had quite the life. He would get up in the morning. Jane, remember we had him on the morning show we did together, and he phoned in from the boat out on Lake Michigan. Right?
Yes, I remember that really well.
He'd be out there at 7 o'clock in the morning. I remember he invited you to come up to the press box. Come on, Ginny, come on. Yeah, sure, come on up and see us. So he was out there in the boat fishing. Then he would get home, do his prep. He would roll into the ballpark about maybe 3 o'clock or so for like a 6, 7 o'clock start. And he would take that Corvette and pull it into the loading dock, which was his private parking spot, you know, and walk in and do the game. And then right after the last pitch, and he'd sign off, he went down the elevator, got in the vet, and drove back to the house in Menominee Falls. He spent most of the time, though, living out in Arizona. But and you know what? The only time you really heard Bob Uecker was during the baseball game. He didn't want to wear out his welcome.
Right.
Yeah.
If you wanted Bob Uecker, you had to listen to a Brewers game.
Yeah.
Well, and he certainly didn't insert himself into other things that he could have just because of the stature that he had. He never ventured into politics. He stuck to baseball. That was his love, and that's what he knew. Yeah, and before the game, you would go downstairs, and I remember this happening one time. Prince Fielder was, the man, the leader for many years when he was on that team. And we were there before, you get to get into the clubhouse before the game to do like feature interviews. And then after the game, you get 5 minutes to talk about the game just happened because these guys have been there all day. They want to get out. So you gets in there and he sits in the office with the equipment manager and they just BS and tell the old stories for like an hour. They did this every day just because he just liked to hang out at the ballpark and hang out with the guys and talking. Mm-hmm. And at one time, the Brewers were in a serious situation, and Prince Field was trying to talk to 2 or 3 other players about something. And these guys, Uecker's got about 8 or 9 guys in the equipment manager's office about 30 feet away, laughing and cackling. And he stands up, looks, and says, "Hey, could you guys tone it down?" And then Uecker realized, oh, man, we're messing with the players. And one by one, all those guys filed out, like, okay, we'll shut up now because Prince Fielder has spoken. But he had that respect for the players. I saw that personally, when that happened. If you're just joining us, Mike Clemens, Civic Media sports reporter, is our guest, and we're talking about news that broke just as we were coming on the air. Milwaukee Brewers out with a press release this morning that Bob Uecker has died at the age of 90 after 54 years. On the team, on the airwaves for the Milwaukee Brewers, just such an intrinsic part of Brewers baseball and Wisconsin. And I think, too, Mike, that because of his stature, because of the Tonight Show, because of Major League and all of those things, I get that. I think he was beloved by most of the country.
He was, and I mean, like Mark Twain. I mean, he's a humorist, a storyteller, and quick, even up to the last minute. You know, he'd say something, and there's things that he would say to you. If you I mean, you know, he pretty much kept to himself. He came in, did his job, went in the booth, went home. But you know, he would joke. He would start people laughing. He'd ask you questions, and you know, he'd tell funny stories. And I mean, that was just natural for him. I tell you, when to find out what Uecker was really like off the air, Google Norm Macdonald on the Letterman Show talking about Bob Uecker.
We're going to go to
I'll
break.
leave it at that.
We're going to go to break. Mike, can you stick around for one more segment?
Sure, we'll do.
Stay with us. You are listening to Matt Nair on air. We'd love to hear your memories of Bob Uecker. 855-752-4842. Stick around. This is the Civic Media Radio Network. We'll be right back. Twitter breaking news right before we came on the air this morning. Milwaukee Brewers out with the statements. Bob Uecker has passed away at the age of 90 years old. We would love to hear your favorite memories of Uecker and his long, long career with the Milwaukee Brewers. 855-752-4842. And again, leave a comment if you're watching on the live stream. Our guest on the phone, Civic Media sports reporter. He is all over the place. Mike Clemens is here to talk about Mr. Uecker. We have some comments on the live stream, Mike. Rob says, Mr. Uecker is Mr. Baseball. I loved him on Mr. Belvedere. My favorite moment was the final out of the 1982 ALCS versus Angels when the Brewers won the American League pennant in 1982.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I was in the loge shooting camera for TV 18. I had just been hired by them that summer. My timing was perfect there, and they were the flagship. And the press box shook. I mean, back and forth. It was when they clinched and beat the Angels in that game. It was an amazing night. Of course, you know that's what Uecker was there for. And you know, when you think about this, when Bud Selig and his partners bring the Seattle Pilots to Milwaukee, and Bud makes his brilliant decision to hire this talent, this funny guy, as a former athlete to be with the broadcasters and work him in. That, you know, things like that, when you bring a new franchise in and you're trying to get people to come back to the ballpark and get back into baseball, and having a guy like Uecker on there for all those initial years, that helped maybe lead to the success of the team. To make it, going to a Brewers game is fun, and, you know, and Uecker being so entertaining on the radio. Moves like that can make a difference in the marketing of your team, right?
Absolutely. And I think too, Mike, it was so obvious how much he genuinely loved the game and loved the players. You can't fake that.
Because, and it showed in that movie Major League, that these baseball players, they're a bunch of characters.
Yeah.
They all got different backgrounds. They all got weird habits. And
Superstitions.
Whether it's superstitions, whether it's during the game, whether it's weird stuff they do in the clubhouse, the stories that they tell. 1 minute these ball players are really smart and incredibly talented. The next minute they do and say some of the dumbest things ever.
Yeah.
Like him saying, I'm out with this guy and he's a big pitcher and now he's in the Hall of Fame, and we took him out to dinner and we went to this famous steakhouse down in Chicago. We were taking on the White Sox, and he ordered the Philip Morgan, and the server didn't know what he was talking about. And he had to point at us. No, sir, that was the filet mignon.
That's a very Wisconsin thing.
Oh, that is awesome.
Yeah. Stories like that just left you crying,
Yeah.
Crying.
And I think that's one of the things that made him so lovable was his ability to poke fun at himself and not take himself too seriously. And he was just joyful about the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, baseball can go long. Now that they've sped it up, I'll tell you, that's an interesting thing to bring up, too. A couple of years ago, the new commissioner, to speed up games, put the pitch clock in, right?
Yep.
And I got to tell you, that frustrated Bob Uecker. It took away his time. I mean, it literally took away his time. He would get into these stories, and it would be 18 seconds, and then strike two, and there wouldn't be those lulls in between or timeouts. And he had to shorten his stories, and I could sense it because I listen. Even when I'm sitting in the press box, there's a program you listen to. You can hear Bob's call live.
Yeah.
Where, they would get to commercial break, and he'd have to hurry up and tell it on the other side. And I knew that was starting to frustrate him. There was one night he was sitting down and saying, "All right, I'm just getting to my seat." He goes, "Is that sponsored now too? Do I have to read something?"
Well, that's one thing I loved about Bob Uecker is he'd be sitting there. So there I was in Los Angeles eating a dinner with it. To an outside going down there and get right back to like sometimes baseball even was like the impediment to his stories, and that was hilarious.
Right. So that I know that was kind of frustrating him. I mean, it was great that the games were moving along, but it kind of hurt his act a little bit.
Yeah.
During those what used to be 3 and 4 hour games.
Yeah.
Is there anyone now, Mike, in baseball, as far as a baseball announcer is concerned, that you think has the same kind of stature that Bob Uecker had?
Not that I'm aware of, Jane. I mean, in terms of to entertain you like that, and I know that answer right away because I've been looking for it, and
right.
I don't know if it exists. And I don't want to take anything away from Jeff Levering or the rest of those guys. They are fun to be with. They do a great job.
Yes.
But Bob Uecker was one of the funniest Americans ever.
Yeah.
Ever. And why do you think Carson had him on over 100 times? As much as, Rodney Dangerfield or Robin Williams or those kinds of guys.
Probably more than Don Rickles.
He was money.
Yeah.
He was money. He was so funny and so entertaining. Vince Scully was, a great wordsmith. Bob Uecker was the comedic storyteller, and I don't know who's doing baseball that's got stories like that ever.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there will be many, many accolades about Bob Uecker, lost today at the age of 90, over the next coming week and certainly weeks. Mike Clemens, Civic Media sports reporter, thanks so much for carving out some time for us. Mike, you're in Green Bay, right?
I'm on my way to Green Bay. Brian Gutekunst is going to do his end-of-season press conference here coming up at noon, so we'll have coverage on that this afternoon on our Civic Media stations.
Listen, for Mike's sports reports, you can always catch them across our network. Thanks again, Mike. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Greg.
Be safe on the road.
Take care.
Joining us every other Thursday at this time to talk all things sports, Milwaukee's Journal Sentinel sports guru, J.R. Radcliffe, is here. And this broke just as we were coming on the air this morning. JR, the loss of Bob Uecker, Mr. Baseball, at the age of 90, and all kinds of tributes coming in and lots of clips from him and all of his appearances on Johnny Carson. And what a remarkable career he had.
Yeah, he really, I mean, he's one of one. It's not, everyone knows that, it's for those who just know him as a baseball broadcaster, they maybe don't even know the history that he has in pop culture as a guy who went on Johnny Carson a lot, the Miller Lite ads that are iconic nationally, but locally, of course, but nationally as well. He's in Major League, of course. I think most people probably know him as Harry Doyle from Major League. Most people outside of the state of Wisconsin. And then to us, he is the voice of all of our childhoods. I mean, I said this on Blue Sky, but as an announcer, as a radio announcer, for as long as he did it, for more than a half century of broadcasting games, he can be the voice of my childhood. He's the voice of my kids' childhood. He's the voice of my parents' childhood, and even my grandparents are young people listening to Bob Uecker on the radio. And how many people can give you that sort of shared experience? We all harken back to things that we loved when we were young and learning about something like baseball. And we all can understand what it's like to be young, listening to Bob Uecker and the self-deprecation, the funny storytelling, but also just the voice of the summer, and for it's such a rare thing to all kind of be able to experience that together. He's an experience. He's a man, of course, but he's also just something we associate with great vibes with baseball, with growing up. So it's really tough to have to say goodbye to that. He's 90 years old. You knew it was coming at some point in the not too distant future, but it doesn't make it easy. It actually hit me a lot harder than I thought it would. I was a little surprised. It's tough news.
Well, and he has been, scaling back a little bit over the past couple of years. Obviously, he wasn't doing all the road games like he used to do. That's a grind for anybody.
Oh yeah, understandably, he's a very private person. He did, he's been in the public eye for 55, more
50
than that,
years.
like
Yeah.
70
Yeah.
years since he's been a baseball player. So understandably, he doesn't share too much. We knew that something was up because at the end of the season, it was just handled a little differently. He didn't do all of the playoff games, which is kind of unusual. They were at home. He was back in the booth for the final outs of of game 3. And Christian Yelich really was emotional talking about him. Christian Yelich and Bob Uecker have forged a really special sort of relationship over the last few years, and you could tell something was not great. And that, no one knew what that was. We didn't know that Bob Uecker was sick. The Brewers have said that he was battling cancer. We didn't know that. He didn't want to share that, and that was fine. Of course, you respect his privacy, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, was that it? Was that the last time we'd hear him? I mean, again, 90 years old, we thought the same thing last year, the year before, the year
Right.
before. Like it's
Right.
it's always something that's going to be on your mind. You don't know how close it is. You don't know if, is it going to be another year or 5? I mean, who knows? So we knew something was not quite right. And, I was hoping the news would be, oh, Bob Uecker's just decided to finally take a break, step away, and we
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
enjoy the last,
Or
couple years.
like this is his last year announcing this, and we will
Right.
celebrate him for one full season.
Yeah, that's what I hoped was going to happen, or something
Yeah.
like that. And at the same time, he loved Brewers baseball more than any of us. I mean, he's doing what he loved until the very final moments of his life, and that's something that we could all aspire to. So in that sense, it's a very wonderful life lived to know that he was able to be part of so generations. Every Brewers fan, because he started broadcasting in 1971 and the team started in 1970. Every Brewers fan, with rare exceptions, from in that first year, have heard Bob Uecker on the radio.
What an incredible through line through, like you said, JR, through generations. Tom from New Berlin texting in, Uecker told a story about how he was on the Dodgers in a playoff game batting practice. He was in the outfield shagging balls as the high school band was there. He grabbed a tuba and started catching balls with the tuba. It cost him $250 for that stunt, but it made everybody laugh.
Man, the MLB just has no sense of humor sometimes. I swear to God.
And that's decades ago. Even then, they didn't have a sense of humor.
Yeah. Honestly, like you're saying all those things, and we were talking about it earlier with Mike Clemens, our sports guy, JR, and I really feel lucky to have grown up in the 80s and 90s at peak Ueckness. He was everywhere. But I didn't watch the Tonight Show because I was a little kid back in the 80s, but Mr. Belvedere, Major League, the Brewers, the Miller Lite ads, the Johnsonville Brat ads. Like, he was just ubiquitous for us. But yeah, he's like, baseball fans know Vin Scully. Baseball fans,
Harry Carey,
Harry Carey, wasn't what I was thinking.
I would say Harry Carey is probably the only other baseball announcer off the top of my head I can think of who is as known as Bob Uecker as far as famousness. The fans know the announcer, baseball fans know the announcers, but he and Harry Carey had this, I don't know,
appeal,
a magic about them that just really appealed to people. And whether it was Harry Carey, who was usually drunk by the second inning, or Bob Uecker, who had that dry, beautiful wit.
Yeah, and then in the 90s, I grew up in the 90s. I think we all probably have a story, but I remember listening to Bob Uecker as a kid when they're on the West Coast. I'm staying up late. I got a boombox in my room in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, listening to Bob Uecker and Pat Hughes call games. That is, and like I said earlier, that's not a unique experience for any of us. But the 90s were tough. The Brewers they sucked. The Brewers were awful. And so how perfect was Uecker, the storyteller, telling stories from his past. He's probably told the tuba story online a bunch, and stories about, how teams didn't want him and they didn't want him going to the plate. Very, famously a much better player than he ever gave himself credit for.
Yes.
While not being a star by any means, he always, he always played up that part of it. And how do you not relate to somebody like that? How do you not relate to a guy who's, out here painting a picture for you of a bad baseball game, but also, while you're here, let's just sit around and chat. We'll talk stories. I mean, that style of broadcasting is hard to find, there's so many broadcasters I respect, but I don't want to call it robotic and make it sound too pejorative, but there's a very specific way that games are called now. And it's guys who come up who are my age, that it's just, there's just not as much personality. I don't think there really can be, because I think fans demand, especially because we have TV as a medium, if you're going to the radio, you want those facts, you want those things that you can't see a lot more because you're used to having them with the TV broadcast. So it's really hard to develop a rapport with your fan base where you can take those risks essentially. I mean, I'm sure we don't think of Bob Uecker as a risk-taking broadcaster, but to just take an inning off and just talk about this time I was with the Braves and, I was catching fly balls with a tuba, that would be really, really annoying, I think, to somebody in somebody else's hands, but not in his, because he's just such a master storyteller.
I think also the magic X factor too, that is, and I also don't want to be pejorative. I don't work in your world, JR, but the reason why we had those individuals, those great broadcasters, because they lived a life too. They lived a big life. They had experience. And Bob Uecker being a player, I think, makes all the difference as well. I mean, there are knowledgeable broadcasters out there who've never played, they know the game, but there's something about listening to someone who has played the game tell those stories in a way that's just different than anybody else, and tell those stories about life on the road. maybe getting rid of certain details that aren't radio friendly, but it's still that, it's like listening to a grandpa or a grandma tell a story. It's just like, tell me another one.
It's gold.
Yeah.
They were all golden.
And how important to just not take yourself so seriously. I mean, Bob Uecker is a kind of a national celebrity, but he's a longtime broadcaster. And then in 1989, he's willing to be this foul-mouthed announcer, Harry Doyle, in this kind of scrappy little sports comedy, Major League, filmed in Milwaukee. No one thought that was going to live in the lexicon of great sports comedies or comedies in general. No one thought that was coming. But Bob Uecker thought, hey, I get to do some of my own stuff. Let's go. Let's give it a shot. That self-deprecation is just so essential to what made him great. And the wit, his Hall of Fame speech, I don't know if people, maybe they're spending some time with it today, back in 2003 when he was given the Ford C. Frick Award. His deadpan, I don't think people realize how good of a deadpan he had with Carson. And then certainly this Hall of Fame speech really exemplifies it. He's just delivering these lines left and right. Like, it's so serious. You'd have no idea that if you just followed his disposition, you would think he was giving a very serious, morose speech, but you hear the words. It's just ridiculous. He had the place in stitches. I mean, he's a stand-up comedian. He really is. He has that wit, the wit and the sort of improvisation of a stand-up comedian. The life that you talked about, he's got that baseball experience, and he just I don't know. He just he was the whole package, and such a unique person at the same time. It's just I just don't. There's no one like him. There really isn't anybody quite like him.
I would encourage people to go on. Almost all of Johnny Carson's shows are on YouTube.
Yeah,
for free.
I know,
through his website. So type up Johnny Carson, Bob Uecker, and the same thing as what you get with a Don Rickles interview. It's just going to be hilarious.
Yeah. I mean, he really is a comedian. And Mr. Belvedere, like you mentioned, is something that I know is near and dear to a lot of people. Yeah. I mean, there are 2 statues of this man at Miller Park, or American Family Field now, of course. I don't know how they're going to further acknowledge him if they do decide to do that. He is the face of Wisconsin sports. Vince Scully is one of the rare other examples I can think of where an announcer transcends the biggest athletes, the greatest Milwaukee Brewers players of the past 50 years. There's some good ones, but even if you go up as high as Robin Yount, he's not the bigger face of this franchise. The franchise is known because of Bob Uecker. Bob Uecker is Milwaukee baseball. Yeah. And he had such a good relationship with the players too. Everybody loved him. He really had that rapport.
I wanted to mention just a little bit about that. He genuinely loved these guys. He genuinely loved these kids who were playing, and I think his ability to help mentor them and just guide them. It was just so apparent that he wasn't faking it. This was his love. Mm-hmm.
He had a locker in the clubhouse, so he would go down there and they would welcome him. This is not that long ago, in his 80s, he's hanging out with players and sharing stories. And Christian Yelich being that emotional, I think just illustrates he really did. There wasn't an age gap there. He just really could be friends with these players and friends with people in this organization. And I mean, I think that came through the radio too. We all felt like he was our friend. He was giving us these funny details and whatnot. So, he even as of a couple of years ago, he looked really spry to me. Upper 80s, it looked like he was still raring to go forever. He was looking in really good shape. And then just lately, I guess it's been a little different.
But something you said earlier, JR, made me think too, during the years when the Brewers were terrible, it was him telling those stories that made it all bearable. And that's why you tuned in. If they weren't necessarily going to have a great game, you knew Uecker was going to bring his best game.
Yeah. And even in addition to that, Later in his years, I don't think it's a secret. The play-by-play probably it wasn't as sharp. Understandably,
Yeah.
the man was in his 80s. Like you weren't getting those details you might get from a different announcer. That's probably not why you tuned in anyway. But when someone hit a big home run and Bob Uecker's on that call for get up, get out of here, gone.
Yep.
I mean, I have goosebumps right now because I didn't want anyone else saying those words. I didn't want anybody else telling me what was going on. You could feel the crowd behind him, the voice, all of it. Like I think of Ryan Braun's home run in 2008. I mean, there are some moments where big Brewers moments, you're just so glad that he's there to tell you, what you kind of already know, but to tell it, call it through. I mean, he was pretty remarkable at that stuff too.
Absolutely. Well, Milwaukee Brewers, Milwaukee, all of Wisconsin, lucky to have Bob Uecker for as long as we had him.
Yeah.
Bob Uecker passed away this morning at the age of 90. J.R. Radcliffe joins us every other Thursday from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Thank you so very much, J.R. Really appreciate your time.
You bet. See you guys soon.
We'll see you in a couple weeks.